right, welcome back to another episode of the Empowerful Health Podcast. Today, I've got a great guest, Kaytlin Brown with Asher Birth and Body. Welcome, Kaytlin.
Thank you.
We're glad to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so obviously you just said my name, but my name is Kaytlin Brown, and I own Asher Birth and Body here in Scottsdale and the Phoenix area. And I'm a licensed massage therapist and certified birth doula. So I help people from pregnancy and beyond. I do work with people who are not pregnant as well in the massage realm. But I love supporting birthing people through the pregnancy process through body work and then education and birth support in like when they actually have their babies. So, and then beyond in the postpartum period.
Yes, which is important. What do they call it? Like the fourth trimester, I've heard it referred to sometimes, is that post-pregnancy, trying to figure out life all over again.
You know, and I think a reason why they call it that, I've read or heard before, is the idea that most mammals gestate longer than 9 months, but because we walk upright, like our pelvises are smaller, right? So we essentially give birth to these babies who aren't fully ready yet. So that fourth trimester is when you should have them close and nearby because they're so dependent on you, because essentially they're still finishing off their development.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so that's why it's a really important time for mother and baby.
Right. Well, and there's a lot. We'll get into that today too. You know, that's what we're going to talk about is empowerment in the whole birth process, and during and after. And we talked about this right before the podcast, but I'm a guy. Like, what experience do I have with this? I do have 5 kids. You know, my wife and I have given. I say my wife and I. She's given birth to 5 children. I've been there through most moments of all those pregnancies, and I was telling Kaytlin that you can imagine most anything that's gone wrong with a pregnancy we've experienced. So. We're hopefully with this discussion, we'll offer both sides. Yours as an expert and a doula, and some of mine is the emotional support and physical support. So,
which is super important.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of that. We don't do, the more we do as teams in this life, the better things work. So,
yep.
So first off, for our listeners, what is a doula?
What is a doula? So, short answer is non-medical birth support. There's actually many different types of doulas, birth doulas, postpartum doulas. There's actually bereavement doulas. So the idea is that a doula is someone who serves and supports. In the birth space, it's emotional, mental, physical, and informational. And that's last one is probably one of the more important ones in the doula world, is supporting people through helping them make informed choices and advocate for themselves in the birthing space and throughout their pregnancy, actually, not just when they're having the baby, but making sure that they know essentially everything they can say no to, and things that should and shouldn't be happening to them throughout their pregnancy and in the birth space. Because I don't have anything against the Western medical complex, but
right.
When it comes to having babies and stuff, there's just a lot of iffy things that can happen. And so helping people to understand, surrounding them with resources on how to make the best choices for them, regardless of what their provider is probably telling them to do, essentially. So it's really empowering work because you're empowering those people to take control of their experience, which is really great.
Which is, the goal of this podcast, right? The only person who cares the most about our health is ourselves, and going into any situation, we can have the best, most amazing healthcare providers, doctors, but you're ultimately, in control of your own health. And the more informed, the more educated, and the more we're, in a way, I think a doula's job is reminding people things too,
Yes.
When you get in the intensity of birth, it's helpful for moms and dads to know there's stuff going on. And what's the right way of saying I'm thinking of? Not know, but to remember the things they thought about before.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot happening in these situations, if you will, and it's helpful to remember that. So
yeah, it's always good to know that you have someone who has seen it before,
right?
Especially with first-time parents. That's kind of I don't have a niche, but I love working with first-time parents because there's a lot of the we have no idea what's going on. I don't know what to expect, what to feel, what am I going to see, what am I going to hear, and then with the partners, how the heck can I support them? And some people assume that a doula replaces the partner, but I like to say that we enhance them.
Sure.
Because it's even more beneficial for the partner to be the hands-on support because of hormones and oxytocin and all that good stuff that can get flowing when you have someone that you trust even more. Ideally, I build that connection and trust throughout their pregnancy, but it's not the same as having your partner hugging you during
someone that you may have
contraction.
been with for
Exactly,
years
yeah.
and hopefully will be with for a long time.
So I whisper, hey, maybe you should try doing this, so that it makes them look like the wonderful, amazing person, and then I'm there obviously doing whatever else they need. So
I love that. The kind of that support, like you mentioned, that non-medical support. I have a couple of fun stories on this. One, like I mentioned earlier, we have 5 kids. Our first one, the goal was all natural. My wife had a birth plan, all this sort of stuff, and then everything that could go wrong went wrong. Second one was pretty similar, but a bigger hospital, and we had a midwife instead of a doctor. And then by our third one, the first 2 ended up being medicated, but they didn't work. My wife had epidurals. Oof. And they didn't work at all. And the first one was the worst part of birth, honestly. Having her get the epidural was terrible. Both of us were in tears. The guy was, it was an odd story, but the hospital just started doing epidurals.
Oh, wow.
Little tiny small town hospital. So anyways, flash forward by our third, we're like, okay, she wanted to do this. The epidurals didn't work anyways. Her goal had always been natural. And so we met with a doula. We hired a doula to help. She wasn't available. She knew ahead of time she wouldn't be available when we were getting ready to give birth. But she's like, hey, I'll come sit down with you, spend 3-4 hours, educate, go over these resources. So she gave us workbooks. And something I remember her telling me was transition. We were talking about transition in birth and how it gets the worst right before it's almost over, you know? And so she did this, and that was in my mind, and then we go into the birth, and it's my wife's third child, right? And by the third child, it goes fast, so, to say the least. So it's progressing really fast. It's getting really intense. My wife's very overwhelmed at this, and I remember telling her, it got where I could tell it was transition. As the layperson, this is what, the doula taught me. This is how it looks, And I remember telling her, hey, remember the doula taught us this? You're getting close. And the look she gave me was priceless. So she'll be embarrassed that I mentioned that. But in her mind, she's like, there's no way. I've only been in labor for 2 or 3 hours. It was very short. But 30 minutes later, we had a baby, Wow. And so I love sharing that story with her. But that's the value of that education, The nurses, midwives, all that stuff were busy, and they just weren't in tune with my wife and what's going on with her body as much. And they just aren't big on education,
Yeah. And it's hard too, because they also might have a number of other laboring patients that I think they try to do a good job of you have this one nurse, or, honestly, the doctor just comes in and catches the baby and is a hero.
Right.
Not really. The birthing person's a hero. But yeah, so that's where having that doula there, and even if they're not there, right? The education that you learned, you knew what your wife was going through based on what the doula taught you, or you knew what to look for, right? Which can be great.
Yeah, and I knew what to say because she shared with us and educated me, as the support there. And I love what you said about, the doula's not replacing a partner, is not replacing a midwife. They're not there to catch the baby. They're there just to support. And I saw that, we had doulas for the last 2 as well. And I remember one of them going to get me food, that kind of stuff where the nurses aren't going to go get you barbecue down the street. But the doula was like, absolutely, this is what you need, and so I was well fed, and they were there to support, and they were invaluable in that birthing experience. So,
it's really, you never forget the birth of your child. Right. So as someone who gets invited into that space by couples, it's really an honor, first of all.
Sure.
And I don't take it lightly, right? So I try to have as many touch points with these people as I can before the big day, right? And hope that they get everything that they wanted, but know that I'm there if they don't.
Sure.
But it's really cool to be a part of such a big moment in someone's life. And I had a friend say once, we're not meant to do big things alone. And I think childbirth is definitely one of those. You're very much alone in the pain and discomfort and sometimes scariness of it.
Sure.
But having the right team around you, and that means doulas, your partner, Your provider everyone works for you, right?
Absolutely.
So you get to control who is on your team and who's there for that day and who's there to support you through all these different ways.
And there are options, which is that, like you mentioned this lightly before, but having the right team and knowing you can trust them, but also having multiple opinions in the room and multiple thoughts, or, doulas, your job's non-medical, right? So you don't have medical opinions on what's happening, but you can remind the parents like, hey, you discussed this. This is what your goal was. Has that changed? Has that shifted? Another great example of that is our first two kids, we had all kinds of complications, what do they call that? Hypertension. So high blood pressure. I'm forgetting the word for it. What's the word?
Preeclampsia.
Preeclampsia. There we go. I knew you would know it. So it was really interesting. Everything that went wrong with each of those went wrong with both, but we had different hospitals and different support. We had a, family doctor who really shortly after my wife gave birth, he stopped delivering babies. So I don't know if it was a coincidence. And then the second one, we had a midwife group, and so it was really interesting to see the difference. And I wanted to highlight one little experience is there was my wife's blood pressure was getting high. The baby's heart rate was dropping. And the nurse at the, request of the midwife comes in with a syringe to like stop contractions because it's getting to a difficult point. They were kind of worried and they wanted to slow things down a little bit. And I remember my wife saying, I feel like I want to change positions. I feel like I want to move to this different position to give birth. And the nurse stopped and was like, let's try it. And they did. They were listening to her and supporting her versus like, no, we need to like stop this because the baby's increasing fear. And I remember another quick experience on the first one with this family doctor when her blood pressure did come up high. He was standing up talking to us in the room. He looks down, sees what her blood pressure was, and immediately like slumps into a chair, And it being on the other end, being able to see what that effect was on my wife, that was not good, and we didn't have support there, but her fear increased. So what also increased? Her blood pressure, right? Yeah. Got higher and higher, and it spiraled out of control, And so having someone else in the room and the situation to support that is helpful, because as a partner too, like sometimes I'm too emotionally involved in her outcomes, and having someone rational, someone calming to help set us both back on track was very helpful.
Yeah. I like that you brought up fear because there's a concept called the fear, tension, pain cycle. And it's widely known in the birth space because there's a great book about it called Childbirth Without Fear. And the idea is that when there's fear in your body will tense up. When you tense up, especially in labor, it's going against everything your body's trying to do. Right. So the pain's going to increase. And then it just starts this like vicious cycle. So most doulas will address that in their like prenatal visits with people, right? Like, let's learn what this is. Let's talk about things that might cause you fear. Let's process through that stuff now. Not to say that if you want an unmedicated birth and you end up with a C-section, it's not going to be scary and cause you fear.
Right.
But you have essentially talked through that before it's happened. Now, we're not trying to manifest those things into happening, but I think it's really important for birthing people and their partners to know that okay, so we come to the hospital and my wife wants an unmedicated birth, but it's way more intense than she thought it was going to be. So we're talking about an epidural. It's a conversation, right? And we've had that conversation before. So here in the moment, it's like, are we going to do it? Are we not going to? Are you at your breaking point? Great, then let's do it. It's a tool that we can use.
Sure.
And we've processed through I guess people feeling like they failed, which is just awful, and people shouldn't do that to themselves. But it's not a failure if you've talked about it before. It's not a failure anyways. But if you've really talked about it and processed through what's my point at which I want this to happen another way, or if it has to go to a C-section, bummer. But is it my choice? Hopefully it's not emergency. I'm making the choice. I'm asking all of the questions. And these are things that as a person who advocates for people in that moment, I'm not necessarily the one speaking for them.
Right.
I'm teaching them to speak for themselves. Now, would I step in if I needed to? Heck yeah. But ideally, I've empowered these people enough with information that they can ask, be those annoying patients, which isn't annoying. It's what they're right.
Right.
and ask like, why are we doing this? Is there anything else we can do? What if we don't do anything? There's an acronym called BRAIN that most doulas use. And this can actually be applicable to like pretty much everywhere in life, but it's benefits, risks, alternatives. What does your intuition say? And what if we do nothing? So you can run through that with every possible situation. And if you need a moment, you ask everyone to leave the room, and your intimate birth team, your partner, your doula, and yourself talk through it. And then they come back in, and maybe they've also done the same thing out in the hall and come up with a different option for you, right? So it's all about just empowering them with information, but making sure that they feel like really safe and supported.
I love this. A concept in life that's helped me a lot is whenever the answer has to be right now, my answer is always no.
Yeah. I like
and
that.
I love this situation. And there are life-threatening situations that need action immediately in birth, but 99% of decisions made in birth are not. Even in situations where there's stress, the baby, baby's heart rate's dropping, things like that. There's time. There's time to stop for a second, rationally think through things. It's hard when mom's in a lot of pain, everything's emotional, there's stuff going on for that. That's helpful for you to be the one to remind them of that, or teach them what questions should they be asking. I ask, as a chiropractor, I ask my patients all the time, what questions do you have for me? Oftentimes I'll hear, I don't know what questions I should have. It's like, okay, let's talk about that then. What should you be asking your doctors? How should you be interviewing people, making sure that your goals and your healthcare provider goals are the same? And then I love that concept of like talking through what's the worst case scenario. We want this perfect natural. There's no perfect birth.
No,
we should clarify that. But what this perfect natural, semi-perfect natural birth, everything hunky dory. But what's the worst case scenario that can happen?
Yeah.
And if you're gonna have I wish we wouldn't even call it the worst case scenario, but if you're gonna have a C-section in this country, like this is the place to have it. We do more C-sections than anywhere else.
Like 33%, I think.
Yeah, a ridiculously high number.
Yes.
But it's and the hard part is what people don't understand is medical doctors have their own viewpoints, and there's a point too where are they doing this because it's best, or are they doing this because it's most convenient and simplest,
or
and
policy.
Right, policies. And that's where like people need to think about which hospitals doulas can help with that. Like, what's your goals? Maybe we should think about different hospitals. My wife and I drove past 3 different hospitals to give birth to our last 2 children.
Yeah.
Because this other hospital had policies we liked and was more supportive of what we wanted to do as parents.
Which is so important. Like your provider in that space, like it starts the moment you find out you're pregnant. You should find the right provider for you. And it's never too late to change.
Absolutely.
It's a little scary at like 38 weeks when you're like, I'm really not loving what I'm feeling from my doctor now.
Right.
I think I want to change. Great. Here's some options. Let's meet with people who can take a late transfer. Like, is it a little stress inducing? Probably. Yes. But to know that you end up in the hands of someone who's going to respect you and support you through like what you want, versus just kind of, something that really bothers me is when people find out they're pregnant and they're like, I'm just going to go with the flow for the first one. And then, do things different the second time. It's like, no, like let's be empowered and do what you want to do and find the right people to support you the first time around in the right space, whether that's hospital, birth center, home, and have the experience that you deserve.
Right.
And that you want versus maybe a not so shiny one. And then switching for the next time and having to heal from this trauma and have this redemptive idea of birth instead of just going for that the first time around. So providers like so important. And that's where a doula can come in and make sure that when you go to those appointments, depending on what type of provider you have, midwives are great, ideal in my mind because you spend longer with them.
Right.
But if you have an OB and you're seeing them for 10 to 15 minutes, there's really like, it feels rushed and that there's not that time. So like what I try to make sure like, all right, when's your next appointment? Here's all the questions we talked about. They're on a list in your phone. Like you make sure that they answer every single one before they leave the room. Will that make them late for their next patient? Probably, but that's not your problem.
Right.
So
and if they're not willing
know.
to answer your questions in a non-stressful situation, like a regular appointment, how willing are they in a stressful situation like childbirth?
Yeah.
Like you need to vet that out and get a feel of how supportive is this doctor going to be.
Yeah. And it's been really like eye-opening to watch the people that I've supported like kind of be bold and ask these questions like, how do you support, blah, blah, blah. Like what birthing, laboring positions do you support? Well, and, for example, a doctor was like, well, you have to be on your back when you push the baby out. And, this person was empowered with information and said, I don't want to do that. This is my plan.
Right.
Will you support that? And is it a weird moment between provider and patient? Yes. But the provider works for the patient. Your provider works for you. So you should get the run that is going to work for you the way that you deserve.
Absolutely. And those little questions that people, first-time parents, things like that, don't necessarily know to ask are very key in using a doula.
Yep.
That's awesome. I love these tips and ideas. There's so much to that. Like I want to share another story about kind of the other options. So we have 5 kids. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 5 kids. So just kidding. The first 2 were, medicated. My wife had, what are those called? Epidurals. And, our third one was all natural, no interventions. I think she did end up having some Pitocin at one point in there, but no medications, none of that. Mm-hmm. Our fourth one was actually a C-section.
Yeah.
And then our 5th one was unmedicated. VBAC is what they call it, a vaginal birth after cesarean. So the one I wanted to highlight, though, was the C-section. We had a doula, we had a midwife. Neither of them can do a C-section, right? Yeah. And so... but both of them were there. It was really cool. I mean, the doula didn't come into the operating room because I don't think she was allowed to. But the support beforehand, we had a baby with stuck breech. And so we were given lots of different options, lots of different suggestions. As a chiropractor, I took my wife to another chiropractor that specializes in breech babies, had them work on her. We did everything we could to try to turn this baby.
All of
the versions, they call them, where they manually... Ooh. They did a version, so when they took her in, set her up for the C-section, took her in and did a second version under anesthesia to see if they could get him to move. And he is a stubborn little kid. He's not 8 years old now, but wouldn't move. We ended up having a C-section, and the midwife is there in the room.
Right.
Super supportive, very excited. And actually, we asked a lot of questions. We knew he was stuck breech. We looked around to try to see if there's someone that would be willing to deliver a breech baby.
Yeah.
We researched it, looked at what the options were. We found a doctor we met with that was willing to do that. There were some other complications that didn't allow that to be an option for us, but we were able to explore. And I remember our midwife was like giddy. She's like, I'd love to help deliver a breech baby, you know, just over the moon. She'd be there. And we would have the best of both worlds. We had this midwife who was there to spend time with us, be supportive. We'd have the doctor with some of the expertise if something goes wrong. And we had everyone there, and it was very much more empowering, even in the non-ideal C-section realm.
Yeah, that's beautiful, though, because so breech birth is a variation of normal, right? Like plenty of providers in the world deliver breech. I mean, I've seen birth videos of like unassisted breech birth, obviously that's, out of my realm, but there's so much fear in the system and like uncertainty, and when it comes to things that aren't just like black and white,
right?
Especially in birth. And so when something is a little bit different, then it just heightens everything, and it makes people, more scared. And you can't do this and this and this and this. So people like yourselves are amazing because you were like, no, if we can do this, like, let's do it.
Right.
Let's find someone who will support us, and it's unfortunate that you have to like hunt for someone who will support that. But ultimately a C-section is still birth. And I think that some people look at it differently, but it's like whatever route your baby comes out, it's still you birthing your baby through your belly or through your vagina. Like it's, and I feel bad for people who have C-sections who feel like when we talk about this again, like failed or something. And it's like, no, it's your journey. It's what your path was. And the next one, maybe you'll be able to do it differently. Maybe you won't. Like, there's some things that are just out of our control, right?
100%. Well, especially with human bodies and health, and, birth and pregnancy is one of the more complicated things a body will go through. And so there are definitely a lot of things that can happen. And having our goal of being ideal, but being willing to work through, and honestly, as a dad going through that, as a chiropractor, very health-minded, the C-section was easy for my wife. It
Mm-hmm.
was the easiest recovery. She didn't have to go through childbirth.
Yeah.
She very much liked that part of it. For me, it was the hardest one because of the emotional component.
Yeah.
As an alternative healthcare provider, like I had failed. I had done all these different things, but I wasn't able to support my wife through this. And I had to do some work to let that go, because we had the kid here. The kid was healthy. Mom was healthy. Her blood pressure, everything came back down afterwards. Like we had everything worked out, And so it's a fine line between striving for ideal and being okay with it. But you said something there, the word can't is one of my least favorite words. I shouldn't say least favorite. It's just a word. But I always tell people like, I am, I'm not, I can, and I can't. We need to be really careful how we finish those sentences.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're dealing with a situation like, say a breech baby or even just basic childbirth, nothing's going wrong. When we feel like we can't, that increases the stress. And like you said earlier, I can't remember the phrasing you used, but stress tightens everything up.
Yeah.
It makes the birth process more difficult. And so being able to feel like, hey, we have options is huge, and that's something that sometimes medical doctors aren't great at giving people options because they'd rather them do this one,
Yeah.
Or like, oh, this baby, it's 8:00 at night. I kind of want to get a good night's sleep tonight. So let's get this baby here in 2 hours, So like that happens often, unfortunately.
A lot of it is done out of convenience for scheduling and and it's something as a newer doula that I'm still learning. I'm still getting my feet or my legs essentially when it comes to not getting angry at this stuff and understanding. But yeah, it's birth is a physiological process. It's like honestly one of like the most natural things that our body does, aside from like using the bathroom every day. But like it's just been so medicalized that it's like almost this feeling of like a little bit of an uphill. It's gotten better actually.
Absolutely. Especially in the last like 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, people are like,
improvements.
There's more out of hospital births happening and people are looking for different types of providers and different options to support different things. But I think in the grand scheme of it, I will support anybody regardless of where they want to have their babies, as long as I know that it's their choice and that they have the right team with them. And then, we help them make a plan, but it's fluid, and you process through and talk about all of the what ifs and things. And then the language thing is, I like that you touched on that because it's like it's a mindset piece essentially. So in the throes of labor, when someone's like, I can't do this anymore, it's like, you are doing this.
Yeah.
Like we're doing it. You're doing it right now, it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard. Doesn't feel good, but you are doing it and your body's doing it. Like, let's tap into
Look at
that.
what you've done so far,
Exactly.
where you're at. Yeah.
And there's really cool ways like in labor to like show them, right? So like mirrors are used a lot, right?
Sure.
To show a birther like how productive their push is, right? And pushing for first time parents sometimes, especially if there's an epidural present, like it's like a huge learning curve. Like, how do I do this, right? Especially because I can't feel down there.
Right.
So having like visuals or helping them to like feel the baby's head as it's crowning, like it's really beautiful to see in their faces.
My chair just fell, so.
Like see in their faces like that, oh, okay, I am doing this. And look how like so close it's right there, So it's really, really empowering.
Well, even someone to coach that language, I can't do this versus this is hard.
Yeah.
There's different connotations to that. They both say the same thing.
Yeah.
But like when we say I can't, we're going to believe that to an extent, And even people do this way before they are in birth,
yes.
That's like earlier on, people doing home births. Oh, I can't do that. It's like, well, you could. You don't have to. Like, there's no obligations. Right? We don't think all moms should be, having babies at home. But if you wanted to, you could.
Yeah.
It would just, you'd do some work. You'd have some learning. You'd do some preparation. You get the right team, the right support. And so I think that's one of the most beautiful things is that no matter which direction people want to go, having the knowledge that they can make that choice and not just have to do something because it's there. My wife and I, we talked about actually doing a home birth for our 5th kid, with all of her complications,
got all
things
the
like
other ones,
this.
I might as well.
She would be a VBAC, even at this
Yeah.
point. And we discussed it. We went over the options, we went over the possibilities, and ultimately decided not to, but we at least consider that possibility versus like, no, we could never. And it's like, well, let's talk about it. Let's work through this and feel empowered in the decision that we do make,
Yeah.
And that's one of the big points of today's discussion is to make sure, wow, we got 30 minutes, which we're shooting for like 15, but obviously we both have a lot to say on this topic. But to make sure that people do have that feeling of empowerment and know that there are options. If you want to use a medical doctor, if you want to use a midwife, you include doulas, family support. My first child, we didn't have a doula. I don't even know if I knew what a doula was that time, but I think my wife did. She was much more knowledgeable than me. But we had several family members there that were supportive and helping, and so having that right team in place and knowing what resources are available is really huge.
Yeah. I think it's important, even if you don't for sure hire a doula, to at least interview them.
Absolutely.
Meet with 3 or 4. There's plenty in the Valley. The birth community here is really incredible. Same with providers, right? Just because you're 8 weeks pregnant doesn't mean you have to lock in on one person. You can really wait as long as you want, honestly, as long as you're getting regular checkups.
Sure.
But interviewing different doulas to make sure that the person who you might ask to be in that space with you is the right person, right? Because we all have different outlooks. We have different approaches. We all have different energy. You want someone who's going to tell you jokes and have fun.
Right.
Find that person. They're out there. You want someone maybe more religious focused who wants to pray with you during your labor.
Sure.
Find that person and know that you've empowered yourself and your birth experience by making sure that the right people are.
I love that. That's huge. Yeah, definitely. Second opinions in healthcare are huge, but even more so in such a life-changing thing like childbirth, Re-interviewing, meeting with multiple people to see, is this the person I want in the room doing one of the most important things I'm going to do in my life? So thank you. This was a great discussion. It was fun to chat with you, Kaytlin. Kaytlin is again with Asher Birth and Body. What's your website? What's your information?
AsherBirthandBody.com.
AsherBirthandBody.com. Okay, great. Well, thanks again for being here.
Thanks.
And we'll see you all next week. Have a great week.